All right, good morning, everyone. So, today we are going to keep talking about sex offenders. Today, what we'll be talking about specifically are registration, sex offender registration, and residence restrictions. And then I'll pull up the sex offender registration list and show you all the sex offenders living near you guys on campus. And then we're going to talk about civil commitment. We've got two quick slides about that, just kind of the basics, and then I've got a short video from PBS to show you about that. So today is quiz day. So we have a lot of people playing Jeopardy next week. So let me just give you that list really fast. So we've got Ashley. I see there's Ashley.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, we've got you, Jordan Well. I see you. Sam Wint. I see you. Darren Williams. Do we have Darren today?
Yes.
Oh, there you are, Darren. And Joshua Williams.
What's going on?
You're playing Jeopardy next week, so don't take your quiz.
Oh, okay, all right.
And Robin. I don't see Robin. So we've got a bunch of people playing Jeopardy. So Ashley Towers, Jordan Wells, Sam Went, Darren Williams, Joshua Williams, and Robin Woodward. Woodard, sorry. So you guys do not take your quiz. You're going to play live on Monday morning. Everybody else, make sure you take your quiz between 10 a.m. today and 10 a.m. Saturday. All right, do we have any questions before we get started? No questions? All right, let's go ahead and pull this lecture up. Okay. Okay. All right, so let's start talking about registration and residence restrictions. So these community protection policies generally have been passed in response to highly publicized crimes against children, usually involving abduction and sexually motivated homicides. However, those offenses are very rare. According to the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, in a given year, only about 115 cases nationwide. There were only about 115 cases nationwide in which children were abducted by strangers. So these policies are put in place to avoid something that only happens about 115 times a year. In reality, most child abusers are well known to their victims, and according to the Department of Justice, 93% of all sexual molestation cases, the child was abused by a relative or an acquaintance. So it's very rare if a child is going to be abused that it is done so by a stranger. What is much more common is some sort of acquaintance or family member would be the perpetrator.
Dr. Hill?
Yes.
What was that percentage again? I'm sorry.
Of the ones that were abused by a family member or a stranger, or I'm sorry, family member or acquaintance, 93%.
Thank you.
So we know it's very rare for a stranger to do this. And although community notification laws are intended to increase awareness of sex offenders living close to children, it's almost never a neighbor that is the perpetrator of these offenses. There was a study done in Minnesota of all sex offenses, especially involving a child, and in only 4% it was a neighbor. So it's very, very rare that it's going to be a stranger, and even more rare that it's going to be your neighbor. Usually it's a family member or an acquaintance that does this. So it's important to note that the public is hugely misinformed about sex offenders in general, which is probably why these policies are still in place. One study even found that the less someone knows about child sex abuse, the more likely they are to support these policies. There was also a study done of legislators in Illinois, and the first misconception that they had was about 78% of them thought that sex offenders are surely likely to reoffend, which we know is not the case. Sex offenders have a really low recidivism rate. So a troubling fact that we see is that the legislators in Illinois, 78% of them are misinformed about recidivism rates of sex offenders. And then when they interviewed them, most of them said that they believed that these laws, specifically registration and residence restrictions, were not effective. They said, we don't believe that these are actually preventing sex crimes, but we have to endorse them because that's what our constituents want, and we're not going to get reelected if we don't endorse them. So first, they're just uninformed in general about sex offender behavior. Secondly, they're aware that these policies are not effective in preventing child sex abuse or just sex abuse in general. And thirdly, they're endorsing them even though they know they're not effective because they know that's what their constituents want. So because of all of those reasons, a variety of federal, state, and local laws of this nature have been passed in the last 2 decades. So registration and residence restrictions are the two areas that have been directed specifically at sex offenders. So anyone convicted of a sex offense is required to register with local law enforcement so their whereabouts are always known. So we see differences in how this particular policy is implemented at the state and the local level. So some states and local agencies will say you only have to be or this small list of sex crimes. Some of them don't have that list at all, and they say if it's of a sexual nature, you have to register. Some of them exclude juveniles, some of them do not. So it really just depends state to state, jurisdiction to jurisdiction as to which types of sex offenders are placed on a sex offender registry and for how long. So right now we've got about 730,000 registered sex offenders in the US. And again, depending on the state and the local level as to where this information is housed, but most of the time you can find all of the information online, allowing citizens to easily identify if one is living nearby. So let's take a look at the sex offenders living near you guys. So again, this varies by state. It varies by the agency that does this. So the Charleston County Sheriff's Office runs this website. So we can see right here, 171 Moultrie Street, the Citadel. We got that right here. And you can see all of the sex offenders living near you guys. So it looks like this guy, Calvin Simmons, is probably the closest. And we'll take a look at these people in a minute. Antonio Aiken seems to be pretty close. Frederick Kinloch also. We don't have a specific address for this guy, so I don't know if he's like homeless, just like living on this corner. I don't know what that means. But you can see we got quite a few of them living near you guys. So let's take a look at who they are. So you can clearly see their names and pictures, aliases, and addresses right here. So we can click on their name. Oh, what the hell? Ugh, sorry. This has been up since the last class. Continue. Oh, sorry, it's making me start over. Oh. Now it's thinking. Maybe I should press search again. Maybe one more time. Okay, here we go. All right, so let's look up Richard Addison. And for some reason, this guy's offense isn't listed. I noticed that in the other class. We'll look at the others, but it tells you the offender type. So in South Carolina, they are split into 3 tiers. So this guy is tier 2. Here we go. This guy, sexual exploitation of a minor, he's also tier 2. And these are all of his separate mugshots. So you can see he's been arrested a couple of times. We see how old he is. We know exactly where he lives. We even have his physical description. You can see, what was the name of the one that lived closest to you guys? Calvin Simmons. Let's find him. Oh man, this guy has a lot of aliases. This guy has my last name. Simmons. Okay. So this guy, criminal sexual conduct with a minor, first degree. He is tier 3, so he's at the top of the tier. But don't worry, you guys aren't minors. You're not in his demographic, apparently. So this is the one that lives right by you guys. So if you're interested, this literally took 2 seconds to Google. I think it was the third link that popped up. But most jurisdictions make it this simple for you to see all of the sex offenders in your area. Questions? Any questions about Calvin Simmons? I don't know how much I could tell you about him.
So what did you say the aliases were? What was that?
All right, you're asking what Calvin's aliases were, or just what they are in general?
Just what they are in general.
So a lot of offenders will go by several different names, and especially the Hispanic offenders, we see that a lot. So they just kind of keep track of their aliases. That way, you know, if you come across this person and they tell you their name is one of the aliases, you know, it's probably this person.
Thank you.
Was there another question? It sounded like
Yes, ma'am.
yes.
How does the tier system work? Like, what are the how do they do that?
So that varies by state and probably by agency. Usually it's kind of like a risk level. So they'll be looking at like your criminal history, the severity of the crimes that you committed. Usually if you've served, it's kind of like a weighted score. So if I had to just guess what ours look like, and it might be thoroughly explained on the website, every state, like I said, is a little bit different how they do this, but usually it's like the crimes that you've committed. So some crimes will be more heavily weighted than others. So probably the violent crimes and the sex crimes will give more weight to the property crimes, the number of times you've been incarcerated, the age you were when you first started committing crimes, your gender, all of those things, that sort of things that are the correlates of criminal activity will kind of go into a database which spits out your tier level, if that makes sense. In this instance, what the tier level is used for is the level of supervision that you get when you are on probation or in the community. So tier 1 has the least supervision, tier 2 is medium, and tier 3 is the most supervision. And that's in general how these things work. Every state is just a little bit different. Some states might have like 4 tiers, some might have 5, some might include some of those variables in their risk score, some may not. Some of them might just look at the crime you're convicted of and your past previous criminal offenses and may not look at incarceration. It really just depends. Does that make sense?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, other questions about this stuff? Okay, let's keep talking about. So now we're going to switch gears a little bit and we're going to talk about residence restrictions instead of the registration. Okay, so many jurisdictions prohibit known sex offenders from living, sometimes saying working. It really just depends on the law. So most of them just say you can't live or work near places where children are present. So the list of places that are no-no zones varies by the law. So usually it's places like schools, parks, daycare centers, playgrounds, sometimes bus stops. What you often see also may be like movie theaters, amusement parks, youth sports facilities, school bus stops, libraries. It really depends on the law that is passed. And usually the common proximity zones are that you can't live or work near one of these places within like 1,000 to 2,000 feet around this area. So everywhere you go, the residence restrictions are a little bit different. You may even have areas where there aren't residence restrictions. So some of these are passed at the state level, but most of them are passed at the local level. So you'll see like local laws or county ordinances that are passed this way. So these laws are usually passed in what we refer to as the domino effect. So what may happen is like Charleston City might pass some residence restrictions, right? And then the sex offenders have a tough time finding a place to live. So they'll move out of the city limits, right? And so all of a sudden, Charleston County will have an influx of sex offenders. So then Charleston County passes that regulation. And then we see them moving outside of Charleston County into what is next door, I think Dorchester County, right? And so then Dorchester County might realize that they've got a lot of sex offenders living in their area. So they pass these ordinances. So that's what the domino effect is that like one area will pass these residence restrictions, the sex offenders will migrate towards an area that doesn't have them, and then that local legislation will be passed there. So let's talk about the logic behind these residence restrictions. So they are based on the seemingly logical premise that by requiring child molesters to live away from places where children congregate, repeat sex crimes can be prevented. However, the research actually doesn't support that at all. There's no support for the hypothesis that sex offenders who live close by child-oriented settings are more likely to reoffend. In fact, empirical research has shown that where a sex offender lives is not a significant contributing factor to their offending behavior. So there was a study done on the child molesters in New Jersey, and about 67% of them met victims in private locations. It wasn't that they were meeting them on a playground or at a school or at a park or something like that. Only about 5% of the New Jersey sex offenders were meeting their victims in these no-no zones. So the research that we have on this shows that sex offenders don't appear to abuse children because they live near schools or parks or daycares. But what's a lot more common is that they take advantage of opportunities to cultivate a relationship with children and their families in order for sexual abuse to take place. So this is what I was saying, like usually it's a family member or an acquaintance that does this. It's not that living near a park makes them more likely to reoffend. It's that they will go out of their way to cultivate a relationship with a family or a child so that this can take place.
I got a question. Is this premeditated, or is this just something in their minds that like they don't like? Because I feel like it'd be a little bit of both. Like some might be premeditated as well as some might be psychological, and they just don't see themselves like making a wrong or like doing something wrong.
If you're asking me to place all the motivations of sex offenders into one box, that's impossible. Usually they're premeditated though. Sex offenders are, especially child molesters, usually have planned this out pretty well. So this is why the residence restrictions don't make a whole lot of sense. It's not like they happen to be walking by a park and see a kid and take the kid. It's usually they have planned a way to get close to this child or to the family, and then over time can cultivate this relationship that can foster long-term abuse, if that makes sense.
So do you think that's one of the reasons why states, I guess, think that it's effective is because, you know, if they take advantage of situations that maybe if they were by these parks that they might have the opportunity or whatever to take advantage of a situation or establish a relationship? Do you think that's why they're implemented throughout states or what?
I think they're implemented throughout the states because the public is so misinformed about this. And because they vote for politicians that say, hey, we're going to get tough on sex offenders, and everybody thinks that's a great thing.
So it's just to please people. Basically. Yeah,
like that Illinois study I was telling you, that most of the legislators know that this isn't increasing public safety, but they're not going to get reelected, you know? Like, could you imagine trying to run on a platform of getting rid of residence restrictions? Like your opponent would have all the ammunition that they needed, you know? But it's like I said, I mean, occasionally, I'm not going to say it doesn't happen that, being around a park, but one of the things we're going to talk about in a minute is this is a residence restriction. Just because you don't like you can't live near a park doesn't mean you can't go sit at a park every day, right? So that's part of the problem. So if you were going to do what you were suggesting, a residence restriction is not going to stop that. So there have been a couple of studies that have evaluated the effectiveness of residence restrictions. You guys are reading one of them this week. Another one evaluated Jacksonville, Florida's policy. They had a 2,500 foot residence restriction ordinance on sex, and they were looking at the effectiveness on sex offender crime rates as well as sex offender recidivism. They did what's called an interrupted time series, meaning they looked at the sex offender rates and recidivism rates before and after the policy was enacted. They found that it made absolutely no difference whatsoever. The results indicated that the city's residence restrictions had no meaningful effect on sex crime rates or sex offender recidivism. So these policies first of all, they're not based on any empirical research. Second of all, when we start to actually evaluate them, we're not finding that they're doing anything. And they are just gaping holes in the logic. So like what I was just saying in response to Josh's question, it just says that you can't live near there, but it doesn't say anything about going to a park and sitting on a park bench all day. Like you could definitely still do that and you'd still be in compliance with your residence restriction. So perhaps what might be more effective are like no loitering zones or reduce like a child safety zone or loitering laws. That might be more effective than a residence restriction. So there's a lot of, oh, yes.
How do you do a child safety zone or whatever? How do you make those happen?
Like how are you asking how that law would be passed or how that law would be enforced?
Enforced.
GPS tracking would be the easiest. Having them on an electronic monitor that would not allow them to be present at that location for a period of longer than like 5 minutes. That would be the easiest. I mean, you could ask a probation officer to like keep tabs on that area, but usually they have like 70 offenders to watch. So the easiest way to do it would be electronic monitoring.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Mm-hmm. All right, so a lot of these policies have some unintended consequences, specifically the residence restriction. So we know, for starters, that the family can suffer from this. A lot of family members receive threats and harassment from neighbors if they've got a sex offender living in their home. The other thing that you have to consider is most of these people are coming out of prison, and we know that most of people coming out of prison are more likely to live with their family, and it's unlikely that their family is going to have a house that falls outside of those residence restrictions. So there was a study done in Orlando, Florida, and 99% of all dwellings were located in one of those no-no zones. So this is kind of why we see this domino effect. The more places you add as a no-no zone and the larger that proximity becomes, the harder it is to find a house that fits that, especially find a house in this person's budget, right? So in Orlando, Florida, only 1% of the homes fall in an area where a sex offender could live, which is a lot of times why you see them kind of clustered together, because there's only a couple of locations where they can live. So if these people are coming out of prison and they're most likely to move in with their family, and it's unlikely that the family is living outside or, outside of one of these no-no zones, what that means is this person then has to move. And we often see that these restrictions can increase transience. So it makes them have to move a lot to sort of be able to, so they might be able to live with a friend for a little bit, and their house happens to fall in an area that's okay, but the friend might say, I don't want you here more than a month, right? So then you got to find another place to live. So these residence restrictions are actually increasing transience, which undermines registration. So if you saw on the registration list, their address is there, but if they have to move every couple of months because of the residence restrictions, like, we're not going to be able to keep track of where they are. So unfortunately, when you have these policies hand in hand, the restrictions will often undermine the registration. And to make matters worse, transience is a predictor of recidivism. In a study in Georgia, they found that every time an ex-offender moved, their risk of rearrest went up by 25%. So some prosecutors and victim advocates have publicly denounced residence restrictions, cautioning specifically what I was saying, that this is causing transience and undermining registration. It just makes it more difficult to track and supervise sex offenders. So make sure you do the reading for this week. It talks about the residence restrictions in South Carolina specifically, and make sure you look at the module or the syllabus. You don't have to read the whole article, just several pages from it. So I'm having you avoid that middle part in the results section with all the confusing statistics and methodology. So you're just kind of reading the intro, the discussion, and the conclusion. So make sure you pay attention to those page numbers so that you don't have to read the whole article. All right, so let's talk about perhaps the most ridiculous policies of all, Halloween policies. So these are kind of randomly dispersed throughout the US. So let me just give you some examples. So for instance, in some New York counties, and this is usually done at the police level. So in some New York counties, sex offenders on probation are required to attend a 4-hour education program on Halloween night. So all the probation and parole officers have to round up all of their sex offenders and wrangle them into the police department and then give them a 4-hour education program to keep them off the streets on Halloween night. In New Jersey, New York, Virginia, Wisconsin, California, South Carolina, and North Carolina, there are curfew policies that prohibit registered sex offenders from going out or even opening their door on Halloween night. And perhaps the most ridiculous one, in Tennessee, sex offenders are banned from going to Halloween costume parties, and they can't even put up decorations. So this is work that the probation officer has to do. They have to go around to their sex offender registry locations and make sure there aren't any pumpkins outside. Okay. So the problem with these policies is that the existence of the risk of sex offenders increasing their behavior on Halloween night is not established anywhere. There were a couple of studies on this that have found no relationships between sexual assaults the 3 days prior to Halloween, Halloween night, and the 2 days after Halloween over a 10-year period. So we don't see any evidence that being around kids on Halloween sort of hypes up sex offenders. So sex crimes against children by non-family members usually account for about 2 out of every 1,000 crimes on Halloween night, which calls into question the justification for diverting law enforcement resources away from more prevalent public safety concerns. So who knows the 2 most common crimes that are committed on Halloween night? What do we think they are?
Vandalism.
That's definitely one of them. What about the other?
Assault.
Underage drinking?
Nope.
Like kids just doing stupid stuff?
Well, that I think falls under vandalism. But there's a deadly
Theft?
offense. No, not theft.
Disturbing the peace?
Nope.
Is it hit and run? You said
Murder.
deadly.
So it does involve a vehicle. Running over a child with your car. That is the most common offense that happens on Halloween night. Children between the ages of 5 and 14 are 4 times more likely to be killed in a pedestrian motor vehicle accident on Halloween night than any other day of the year. So what researchers and policymakers are saying is that officers shouldn't be running around checking on decorations for Halloween or making sure that these sex offenders aren't out past curfew. They need to be directing traffic to make sure kids aren't being run over in the street, as well as having a presence around so that the city isn't vandalized. Vandalism may not sound like a very big deal, but those crimes can really add up. Usually each vandalism incident is about $1,500. So if we've got a bunch of those happening on Halloween night, that can really put a dent in the city's budget. So law enforcement should be spending time deterring vandals and controlling traffic on Halloween night, not being worried about what sex offenders are doing. So a lot of police chiefs have been asked about these policies, and they said that they noted that they are not developed in response to actual attacks that have occurred on Halloween or some sort of trick or treat context. They just feel like it makes sense. So where do we go from here? These programs are underfunded. They're stretching local and state criminal justice budgets thin. What it's suggested is that if we're going to keep the registration, we should use it for the high-risk sex offenders to keep the public informed about the dangerous ones and to reduce the collateral consequences for the low-risk offenders. So as we saw when we clicked through, a lot of them were tier 2 and a few of them were tier 1. So perhaps just the tier 3 are the ones that we need to be focusing on, or specifically the ones that are only committing sex crimes, not committing a sex crime in conjunction to thousands of other crimes that they've been convicted of. All right, questions about this stuff before we talk about civil commitment?
I've got a question, ma'am.
Yes.
So I know earlier, I don't know if it was today or Wednesday, you talked about how offenders sometimes have to go around to their neighbors and tell them what happened.
Yeah.
I guess it's a little off topic, but if you buy a house in a neighborhood where there's an offender in the area, does a realtor have to tell you that they're there?
It really depends on the local ordinance. Chances are no. They just might require that the offender introduce themselves. It's unlikely that the realtor knows that.
It'd make it a lot harder to sell a house too.
Yeah, so the realtor may not want to disclose that information.
And get a better price, I guess.
Yeah, well, that
Yes, no.
takes away their commission. It's kind of like trying to sell a house in which someone died in. They are usually legally required to tell you that. But our house that I'm in right now, the little old lady who lived here died in our living room, and our realtor didn't tell us that. Our next door neighbor came over and was like, "Oh yeah, Iris died right there." And I was like, "What?" So I use like all the sage in the world. And I think Iris has moved on. I don't think she's hanging out here. Anyways, I thought they were legally obligated to tell us that, but my realtor did not tell me that. Yes, Sam.
If say you're living somewhere if you're a sex offender living somewhere that you're allowed to live in, and someone starts to build a school down the street, are you then forced to move even if the government is coming into where you were previously?
Yep. The residence restrictions are problematic. Other questions about that? All right, so civil commitment. So traditionally this was used for the mentally ill. The first legislation allowing for it allowing for sexual predators was in the 1930s, but this kind of fell out of practice in the 70s. So civil commitment is a process that physically forces an individual to receive treatment, usually after they are done serving their term of incarceration. The 1990s is the first time, in Washington State specifically, was the first time we started reenacting these policies for sex offenders. So what happened here was an offender who was approaching release of his 10-year sentence for kidnapping and assaulting 2 teenagers told the parole board, or told, I think it was the warden, or let officials know that he was planning on torturing children upon his release. So they tried to have him civilly committed, but at the time, it was the only statute they had was for mental illness, and he didn't have a mental illness, so they failed. 3 years after he was released, he kidnapped a 7-year-old boy and sexually assaulted and murdered him. So because of that, Washington State said, yep, we're going to reenact this. So we have about 20 states that currently have civil commitment statutes for sex offenders. And in most states, you just have to be labeled as a sexually violent predator. That's what SVP stands for. And every state is a little bit different about how they classify a sexually violent predator. Some are more specific, some are really broad. In Florida, it is defined as a small but extremely dangerous number of offenders who are highly likely to sexually reoffend. So it's pretty vague in that state as to how you get labeled as a sexually violent predator. And once you're labeled that, they can civilly commit you indefinitely. So it's super duper expensive. So the cost of civil commitment is really high. It's usually 2 to 3 times higher than a traditional prison sentence. And despite the growing number of people that they commit, releasing them is really rare. Usually between 1990 and 2000, only 20 offenders nationwide were released. So researchers suggest other less costly solutions. So if we know that you're going to be labeled as a sexually violent predator, perhaps we could just give you a longer period of incarceration and or force the treatment while you're incarcerated instead of making you serve your term of incarceration and then give you treatment. Or just put them on lifetime probation. Probation is usually only about $1,400 a year. Even intensive treatments or intensive supervision probation is less than $2,000 a year. So this is a lot cheaper than civilly committing them. We don't really have any empirical studies on this because the sample size is low. Almost no one is released. There was one study that did follow 61 offenders who were almost given civil commitment, and about 28% of them reoffended. So they were saying that perhaps we could have, prevented 28% of these crimes, but that's not great methodology. But the biggest problem with civil commitment is identifying who needs to be civilly committed and then assessing them when we determine that they're ready for release. There's no national or state standard for that. Every state kind of does their own thing, and it's pretty sort of subjective. All right, let's watch this video.
Next, the difficult question of how to deal with people convicted of sex crimes, specifically what to do with young juvenile offenders. Should they be locked up indefinitely? Do they belong in facilities designed for some of society's worst adult offenders? William Brangham traveled to Minnesota for this report, part of our Broken Justice series.
This facility in the rural town of Moose Lake is where Minnesota puts the sex offenders it says are too dangerous to live on the outside. 29-year-old Craig Bolte is one of them. He's been locked up for nearly half his life. It started when he was 15, when he pled guilty to sexually assaulting a younger member of his family and also admitted to sexual contact with another minor. He says these were very troubling years for him.
I was sexually abused on numerous occasions as a child, when I was a young child, and that is by no means an excuse. I'm responsible for my actions. I still hurt people.
Bolte was originally sentenced to 3 years, but he's now been behind bars here in Minnesota for 14, locked up with hundreds of rapists, child abusers, and other sex offenders. They're all being kept by what's known as civil commitment law, which allows a state to deem someone an ongoing threat, and even after their sentences are served, keep them locked up indefinitely.
I've been in for about 10 years now. All in all, I've been locked up for 14 years, 10 years of it here, though.
The PBS NewsHour was granted rare access to Minnesota's sex offender program.
Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you.
We could film interviews inside this one room, but almost everywhere else we could only take still photographs. Most everyone agrees that there are people locked up in Minnesota's program who are very likely to reoffend. These are people who say they simply cannot control their behavior. And that concern is why legislatures in 20 states have set up programs like this to hold these people. But others say these programs also end up snaring juvenile offenders who they argue have no business being held for years past their sentences.
It's outrageous. That is one of the more outrageous features of this program.
Eric Janis is a law professor and longtime critic of Minnesota's sex offender policies. He says juvenile sex offenders are almost never the kind of lifetime sexual predator that society needs to worry about.
Probably a fairly high percentage of adolescent sexual offending is basically due to immaturity and experimentation. And so it's not deviant sexuality. It's not that they are attracted to violent sex or involuntary sex. It's that they are immature, and that's the kind of thing that they'll grow out of.
Juvenile sexual behavior, like every other kind of behavior, changes very rapidly.
Elizabeth Letourneau is one of the nation's leading experts on juvenile sex offenders. She directs the Moore Center for the Prevention of Child Sexual Abuse at Johns Hopkins University. She says civilly committing juvenile sex offenders makes little sense, first because it's incredibly costly. Minnesota spends about $125,000 per offender per year, which is roughly triple the cost of regular prison. But most importantly, she says it doesn't make sense because juvenile offenders are not likely lifetime offenders.
Among youth who are adjudicated for a sexual offense, so they've been arrested, processed, 97 to 98% will not reoffend sexually. So truly the vast majority,
almost all of them,
will not. Almost all youth, if they are caught committing a sexual offense, will not do it again.
Emily Piper is the commissioner of Minnesota's Department of Human Services, which oversees the state's sex offender program. She says only 4% of Minnesota's registered sex offenders are currently civilly committed, and she argues the state is rightly incarcerating the most troubling of those.
The sex offenders in our program have some of the most horrible criminal histories and horrible crimes in their past of any sex offenders in our state.
However, there are currently 67 men like Craig Bolte who have been locked up for crimes they committed as juveniles.
Many of these young men, dozens of them, who were put in for crimes they committed when they were juveniles, and now they're in their 30s and 40s and 50s. Is this the right place for them?
You know, I would say many of the people that are committed as juveniles don't have a lot of life experience outside of being confined. And so when we're working with them, we need to make sure that we're appropriately and adequately reintegrating them into our society.
That's the stated goal of the program, to give mental health treatment to the offenders and release those who are deemed ready for life on the outside. But in the last 2 decades, not one person has ever been fully released back home. More than 40 have died while in commitment. The oldest man here is 94. Several are older than 70.
Once the door is closed, you know really quickly that you're going to die here, and that's your only way out.
Alfonso Rodriguez Jr. is on death row.
The use of civil commitment took off in Minnesota as a result of a particularly harrowing case. Alfonso Rodriguez Jr. spent 23 years in prison for rape and attempted kidnapping. But 6 months after getting out, Rodriguez struck again, kidnapping college student Drew Shadeen.
That was at her brother's wedding in 2002.
Linda Walker is Drew's mother.
We're almost positive that he had her for 3 hours, brutally raped and tortured her, then walked her down in a ravine and slit her throat and left her to die.
Outraged that someone like Rodriguez had been set free, Walker helped create a national sex offender database where communities are notified if former offenders move into their area. And her advocacy in Minnesota helped expand that state's use of civil commitment. In 2003, less than 200 men were civilly committed in the state. But in the wake of Drew's rape and murder, that number has more than tripled to 725 today.
I realized that we needed more tools in our chests to protect our society from those that choose to violate and to rape our women and children.
So you don't think that there's any rehabilitation for this level of criminal?
I do not.
There's nothing that can be done?
I do not believe there is. Nope.
I feel horrible for Drew Shadeen's mother. I sympathize with where she's at and what's happened to her daughter. But Craig isn't even close to Alfonso, whoever did what he did.
Rodriguez.
It's a total different animal, in my opinion. Craig, when he was a baby with my dad.
Craig Bolte's mom, Michelle, is now one of his biggest advocates, even though she and her husband were the ones who first turned their son into the police years ago.
Honestly, when I look back, I feel like I gave my child a life sentence.
Michelle was just 14 when she gave birth to Craig. She says it was early on, when Craig was a toddler, that he was first sexually abused by an older family member who lived with them.
My family has a history of sexual abuse. I was abused. My brother was abused. Now my son was abused.
She says it's that history that led to Craig's childhood abuse of other kids. But she now believes her 29-year-old son deserves a second chance to live in society.
You can't sentence a child murderer for life. But you can, state of Minnesota, sentence a child sex offender for life. I mean, it's just a total double standard. It makes no sense because you hide behind that it's treatment.
In 2011, a class action lawsuit was brought against the state by a group of offenders in Minnesota's program, including Craig Bolte, arguing they were not getting any meaningful treatment and were instead being held indefinitely. And last year, a federal district judge in St. Paul sided with them, saying that Minnesota's sex offender program was unconstitutional, ruling, quote, "It's a punitive system that segregates and indefinitely detains a class of potentially dangerous individuals without the safeguards of the criminal justice system." The state has appealed the decision, and a ruling is expected this fall. In the meantime, state officials say they've already started making changes. 5 offenders have been moved into less restrictive settings, and new reviews are being done of all offenders to determine who's a potential candidate for release and who isn't. Even Drew Shadeen's mother, Linda Walker, admits that maybe some juvenile cases should be re-examined. But she hopes that in all its reforms, Minnesota will err on the side of caution before releasing anyone.
We're constantly taking the victims out of the equation every time we sit and analyze these people. And what about their freedom? They don't get it back. Drew's never going to get hers back.
Craig Bolte says he's a changed man and that he's hopeful for the first time that he might one day get out.
There's a lot of people who will hear what you have to say and that they're simply not going to forgive what you did. And so they say, look, we got to lock them up and throw away the key. What is your response to that? What do you say to those people?
I say, let me prove it. Let me show you what kind of man I am today. Let me prove that I'm not the kid that I was that did those things.
In addition to the changes in Minnesota, Missouri and Texas have also recently begun reviewing their civil commitment programs for sex offenders. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm William Brangham in Moose Lake, Minnesota.
All right. So, any questions before we call it a day? No questions? Okay, let me just read the giant list of people playing Jeopardy one more time. We got Ashley Towers, Jordan Well, Sam Wint, Darren Williams, Joshua Williams, and Robin. Did Josh ever get here? I do not think so. Okay.
I'm here.
Oh, yeah. Oh, it wasn't you that was missing. Who was missing?
No, that was me. I was late like 4 minutes.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, you are playing Jeopardy, so don't take your quiz today. If your name is not on that list, make sure you take your quiz. It will open in 11 minutes, and you have until Saturday at 10 a.m. If there's nothing else, everybody have a lovely weekend, and I will see you guys on Monday. Oh, wait, I will not. We are not having class. That's right. How are we going to play Jeopardy? We're going to have to play Jeopardy much later. I'll send everybody an email.
Dr. Hill, we good to meet right after this?
Is that what we have written down today?
Start at 10, but if,
oh, yes. Patrick, that is you. Yes. Sorry, I thought that was somebody else. Yes.
You want to go ahead and start now, or?
No, I need to eat something.
Sounds good.
I'll see you in 10 minutes.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, bye.